children do exist because I don't think Charlie would lie about having kids. Erica, on the other hand, as we've seen, lies like she breathes, like she has it down to.
Nobody expected the courtroom to become the place where Erika Kirk's entire public image allegedly started falling apart. But according to explosive reports now spreading across social media, one legal ruling may have just changed everything. For months, the internet treated the rumors surrounding Erika's family situation like messy online gossip. People debated timelines, questioned old interviews, analyzed blurry photos, and argued non-stop about whether there was actually any truth hiding underneath all the speculation. But then came the moment nobody saw coming. A judge reportedly ordered a DNA test, and when the alleged results surfaced, the entire conversation around Erika Kirk instantly exploded into something much darker than internet drama. Because now people are saying this isn't just about rumors anymore. It's about custody battles, possible child support payments reaching $20,000 a month, hidden timelines, and questions that viewers believe were deliberately kept buried for years. And trust me, the deeper people dig into this story, the messier it gets. Old clips are resurfacing, past statements are being dissected frame by frame. Photos people ignored before are suddenly being treated like evidence. And critics are now asking whether Charlie Kirk may have discovered devastating information shortly before his final days. That's the part making this situation spiral completely out of control online. Because according to theories now flooding social media, the courtroom ruling may have exposed far more than just a custody issue. It may have cracked open an entire hidden narrative that people believe was quietly unraveling behind closed doors, while the public saw something completely different. And now, the internet is tearing apart every detail, trying to figure out one terrifying question. Wealthfer, how much did Charlie really know? And when did he allegedly find out? Because if even half of these claims are true, this could become one of the most shocking public scandals the internet has seen in years. To understand why the situation has blown up the way it has, you have to understand the image Erika Kirk built around herself from the very beginning. On the surface, she wasn't positioned like a typical internet personality or influencer. She was presented as someone grounded, disciplined, and deeply rooted in faith-based values. The kind of public figure who doesn't chase attention, but somehow still ends up at the center of it. And that image mattered, because audiences don't just follow people. They trust narratives. And for years, Erika's narrative looked stable, a committed relationship, a growing family, public appearances that reinforced consistency, and a carefully maintained distance from controversy. Nothing about it, at least publicly, looked chaotic. But according to online speculation that later spiraled into viral discussion threads, that calm exterior started to look different when people began re-examining old details with fresh eyes. Not because of one single event, but because of a growing pattern of questions that never fully got answered in a satisfying way for internet audiences. At first, it was subtle. Small inconsistencies people claimed they noticed in timelines, old clips being replayed with new interpretations, photographs that suddenly started circulating again after years of being ignored, and interviews where Erika spoke about her personal life in ways that, at the time, seemed normal, but later became fuel for speculation. The internet has a strange habit of doing this. It doesn't need new evidence. It reinterprets old content until it feels new. And that's exactly what started happening here. Then came the children discussion. For many people, this became the emotional center of the entire conversation. Not because of what was confirmed, but because of what was unclear. Supporters of Erika insisted from the beginning that there was nothing unusual about her protecting her children's privacy. And in many ways, that argument is completely valid. In a world where public figures are constantly exposed and overanalyzed, keeping children out of the spotlight is often seen as responsible parenting. But critics saw something different. They argued that the consistency of blurred images, partial appearances, and carefully controlled visibility created questions rather than answers. And once that interpretation took hold online, the narrative began shifting quickly. Then there was her past relationship timeline. This is where things started becoming more complicated in online discussions. Old names resurfaced, old appearances were re-examined. Old clips from public events were rediscovered and reposted with entirely new commentary layered on top. People began mapping timelines like investigators, who was where, when, and with whom. And as more users joined in, the conversation became less about facts and more about perceived patterns. That's where internet narratives tend to become dangerous. Because once enough people start believing they are connecting dots, even unrelated details begin to feel meaningful. Then came the viral turning point. A court-related claim began circulating online, suggesting that a DNA test had been ordered in connection with a custody matter. That single claim, whether fully verified or not in every detail, completely changed the tone of the conversation. Because legal involvement changes perception instantly. Rumors become cases. Speculation becomes developments. And online discussions start treating uncertainty like confirmation. And that's when everything escalated. From that point forward, every previous detail in Erika's public life was re-examined under a new lens. Old interviews where she spoke about her family suddenly gained new interpretations. Past appearances that once seemed normal were now being slowed down, paused, and analyzed frame by frame. Even harmless statements were being reinterpreted as potential clues. And the internet, once again, did what it always does in situations like this. It built a full narrative out of fragmented information. But what really intensified everything wasn't just the rumors about legal proceedings. It was the emotional layer people started attaching to the story. Because as discussion spread, users began linking unrelated events into a single evolving storyline. Family questions, relationship history, financial speculation, public behavior changes. All of it began merging into one large ongoing theory that Erika's public image may not fully match her private reality. And once that perception took hold, the conversation became extremely difficult to contain. Supporters of Erika pushed back strongly. They argued that privacy doesn't equal secrecy, blurred photos don't imply wrongdoing, timelines can be misinterpreted, and internet speculation often goes too far, and they are not wrong to say that. But critics countered with a different perspective entirely. They claimed that too many elements didn't feel fully explained. Too many moments felt inconsistent. And too many resurfaced clips raised questions that never received clear public clarification. That clash of perspectives is exactly what turned this into a viral storm. Not certainty, but disagreement. And in the middle of all of it stood Charlie Kirk's name. Because once people began connecting timelines, his role in the narrative became unavoidable in online discussions. Every theory eventually looped back to one central question: what did he know, and when did he know it? And that question alone has been enough to keep this entire situation trending across platforms for days. Now, whether someone views all of this as speculation gone too far or as a legitimate set of unanswered questions, one thing is clear: the internet has already decided this story is far from over. And the next developments, whatever they turn out to be, are going to be watched, analyzed, and dissected in real time. The moment the court filing was officially unsealed, everything that had been quietly building behind closed doors finally broke loose in a way nobody could control anymore. At first, it didn't look like much. Just paperwork, just legal language, just another routine update in what people assumed was a standard family dispute. But within minutes, insiders started reading between the lines. And what they saw changed the entire direction of the case. Because this wasn't just about custody anymore. It was about parentage, timing, and a series of statements that no longer aligned with the documented evidence now being presented in court. And once that contradiction appeared on record, the entire narrative surrounding the family began to fracture in real time. The courtroom shift nobody expected. According to sources close to the proceedings, the hearings started off calmly. Both sides entered the courtroom with what appeared to be confidence. Carefully prepared statements, structured arguments, and a clear attempt to present stability. But that stability didn't last long. Because midway through the session, the judge reportedly requested the introduction of additional verification material that had not been fully addressed in earlier filings. That single request changed everything. What followed was a tense exchange between legal teams. As documents were reviewed line by line, timelines were compared, and inconsistencies began to surface in ways that could no longer be ignored. And then came the moment that allegedly shifted the entire energy in the room. A DNA verification report, submitted under court supervision, was referenced directly in the proceedings. No theatrics, no build-up. Just a direct acknowledgement that the results had legal relevance to the custody structure being debated. And that's when the atmosphere reportedly shifted from procedural to intensely personal, because suddenly this was no longer about arguments or accusations. It was about biological connection being placed under formal scrutiny. The first twist: the timeline doesn't add up. What made the situation even more explosive wasn't just the report itself. It was what the report implied when matched against previously stated timelines. Court analysts reportedly began cross-referencing earlier testimonies, public statements, and submitted documentation regarding relationship history and family formation. And that's when the first major contradiction emerged. A sequence of dates, previously presented as straightforward, did not align cleanly with the biological findings being discussed in court. At first, it looked like a clerical issue, something minor, something that could be explained away. But as the comparison deepened, the inconsistencies didn't shrink, they expanded. And in legal settings, when inconsistencies expand instead of resolve, they stop being errors and start becoming questions. Serious ones. Questions that can reshape custody decisions entirely. Private reactions turn into public panic. While the courtroom remained sealed, the outside world was already reacting in real time. A few vague leaks were enough to ignite chaos online. At first, it was confusion, then speculation, then full-scale narrative warfare. Some users insisted it was being exaggerated. Others claimed it confirmed suspicions that had circulated for months. And a third group began pulling old interviews, past appearances, and archived clips, trying to reconstruct a timeline that suddenly no longer felt stable. Within hours, social media wasn't just discussing the case. It was rebuilding it from scratch. Every past statement was now under reinterpretation. Every photo became evidence. Every silence became suspicious. And every contradiction, no matter how small, became part of a growing theory that something much larger had been hidden beneath the surface for years. But what made things even more volatile was the reaction from people closest to the situation. Because according to early leaks from inside legal circles, the ruling didn't just affect custody discussions. It may have triggered a reassessment of financial responsibility as well. And that's where things took another sharp turn. The financial pressure emerges. Once the custody structure was challenged, attorneys reportedly began discussing support obligations tied directly to the updated findings. And that's when a new number started circulating quietly through legal commentary circles. A potential monthly obligation figure that, if enforced, could reach 5 figures. Not confirmed, not finalized, but enough to send shockwaves through anyone following the case closely, because suddenly this wasn't just emotional anymore. It was structural. Custody, responsibility, financial recalibration. 3 areas of law colliding at once, and each one depending on the outcome of the DNA-related findings, now sitting at the center of the case. That's when insiders say the tone of the legal discussion changed again. What had started as a family matter was now being treated as a long-term legal restructuring case. And that shift carried consequences far beyond the courtroom. The leak that made everything worse, just when things seemed like they couldn't escalate further, a partial leak surfaced online. Not the full report, not verified documents, just fragments, screenshots, alleged summaries, interpretations from unnamed sources. But in the digital world, fragments are often enough. And this one spread fast. It suggested that certain prior declarations made during earlier stages of the relationship might not align with the newly reviewed biological evidence. That single implication detonated online discourse, because it reframed everything people thought they understood. What was once seen as a straightforward family narrative was now being discussed as something far more complex, layered, and potentially misrepresented over time. And as expected, the internet didn't wait for confirmation. It filled in the gaps itself. The first emotional break in court inside the courtroom, things reportedly became visibly more strained after the DNA discussion was formally acknowledged. Legal observers noted a shift in body language, tone, and pacing. Arguments slowed, responses became more careful. And at several points, proceedings were paused to allow both sides to regroup privately. Because once biological evidence enters a custody case in this way, it stops being just about legal rights. It becomes about identity, trust, and long-term credibility. And those are not easy things to defend under pressure, especially when every word is being recorded for judicial review. The twist that nobody saw coming, but the real shock didn't come from the DNA report itself. It came from what was reportedly referenced alongside it. According to early leaks, the court was also presented with previously unaddressed communication records. Materials that allegedly raised questions about when certain individuals became aware of the biological uncertainty now being discussed. This is where everything shifted from complicated to dangerous, because it suggested that at least part of the situation may not have been newly discovered at all. It may have been known earlier, possibly much earlier. And if that turns out to be accurate, then the entire foundation of the custody argument changes again. Not just emotionally, legally, strategically, completely. A case that can no longer contain itself. By the end of the hearing, nothing was resolved, no final ruling, no public statement, no clean conclusion. Just more questions than answers, and a growing sense that this case has expanded far beyond what either side anticipated when it began. Outside the courthouse, reporters scrambled for clarity. Inside the internet, theories multiplied faster than facts, and in legal circles, one thing became increasingly clear. This is no longer a simple custody dispute. It's a multi-layered investigation into timelines, truth, and previously undisclosed history that is now being forced into the open under judicial pressure. And as the first twist settles in, one reality becomes impossible to ignore. This was only the beginning, because the next set of revelations won't just challenge the case. They may completely redefine who knew what and when they knew it. And that question leads directly into the next phase, where everything escalates beyond control. What followed the courtroom twist wasn't calm. It was chaos on a completely different level. Because the moment those early leaks began circulating, the story stopped being a private legal matter and transformed into something much larger. Something that people across the internet started treating like a live, unfolding investigation. And once that happens, control is gone, completely gone. Within hours, discussion threads multiplied across every platform imaginable. People weren't just reacting anymore. They were actively reconstructing the entire timeline from scratch, trying to figure out where things first stopped adding up. And the deeper they dug, the more unstable the story became. The internet turns into an investigation board. At first, it started with harmless curiosity. Old clips were resurfaced. Interviews were rewatched. Social media posts were pulled from archives and reposted with new captions attached. But very quickly, it escalated into something else. Entire timelines were being built publicly. Side-by-side comparisons of statements from different years began circulating, with users highlighting contradictions that had never been noticed before. And suddenly, what once looked like a simple family narrative started feeling like a patchwork of missing pieces. Every new discovery didn't clarify the situation. It complicated it further. And that's when the second wave of leaks hit. The second leak changes everything. Unlike the first set of fragmented rumors, this one was more structured. Not official documents, but more detailed summaries allegedly sourced from individuals close to the proceedings. And the implications were far more serious. Because according to these circulating claims, the court wasn't only reviewing biological evidence anymore. It was also reviewing communication history tied to key moments in the relationship timeline. That detail alone sent shockwaves through online discussions, because it suggested that awareness of certain facts, particularly regarding family structure and past relationships, may not have been as recent as originally believed. In other words, some people may have known more for longer than they ever admitted, and that possibility changed the entire emotional tone of the story. A hidden timeline begins to surface. As these claims spread, a new narrative began forming online. Users started mapping out a hidden timeline, a version of events that allegedly differed from the public-facing story. They pointed to gaps, periods of silence, overlapping relationships, and moments that at the time had seemed insignificant, but now felt loaded with meaning. Even small details, like when certain individuals first appeared publicly together, or when major life announcements were made, were suddenly being reinterpreted as potential indicators of something more complex happening behind the scenes. And once that reinterpretation began, it became unstoppable. Because every new angle raised the same question: was the public story ever the full story? The emotional divide widens as the theories intensified, so did the divide between audiences. One side insisted this was nothing more than online speculation spiraling out of control, fueled by fragmented information and overanalysis. The other side argued that too many inconsistencies were now visible to ignore, and the conflict between those two perspectives only added more fuel to the fire. Because every time one side pushed back, the other side doubled down with more evidence. Screenshots, old interviews, clips taken out of context but now reinterpreted under a completely different lens. The internet wasn't just discussing the case anymore. It was emotionally invested in proving a version of it. And that emotional investment made everything more volatile. The shocking reveal that shifted public perception then came the moment that changed the tone again. A new set of claims began circulating, this time focusing not on biology or timelines, but on awareness. According to these allegations, certain individuals involved in the case may have had prior knowledge of the underlying custody-related questions long before the court formally addressed them. That suggestion alone was enough to completely shift public interpretation. Because if true, it reframed the situation from a sudden legal discovery into something that had been slowly unfolding behind closed doors for years. And that changes everything. Trust, intent, and perceived honesty. Suddenly, viewers weren't just analyzing events anymore. They were analyzing intentions behind the events. And that is where narratives become emotionally explosive. Social media eruption hits peak intensity. Once that idea spread, social media reaction hit another level entirely. Hashtags began trending. Comment sections turned into debates. Long-form breakdowns started appearing from amateur analysts trying to piece everything together, and each interpretation contradicted the next. Some insisted the entire situation was being exaggerated. Others believed the truth was finally starting to surface. And a growing group of viewers simply admitted they no longer knew what to believe at all. But uncertainty doesn't slow the internet down. It accelerates it. Because the lack of clarity invites speculation, and speculation fills every gap it finds. The courtroom silence adds fuel. Meanwhile, inside the legal environment, silence continued. No official clarification, no public statement addressing the leaks, no confirmation of what was real and what was misinformation, and that silence became its own form of amplification. Because in the absence of verified information, speculation becomes dominant. People began interpreting the lack of response as strategic. Others saw it as procedural. But regardless of interpretation, the effect was the same. The narrative kept growing without boundaries. A new layer of complexity emerges. Just as the situation seemed like it couldn't become more layered, another detail entered the conversation. Allegations began circulating, suggesting that earlier decisions within the family structure may have been influenced by external pressures, whether emotional, financial, or relational. Nothing confirmed, nothing officially documented in public view, but enough to reignite the entire debate about how the situation developed in the first place. Because now the discussion wasn't just about what happened. It was about what led to what happened. And that is a far more complicated question to answer. The public narrative starts collapsing into pieces. At this stage, the original story people thought they were following barely resembled what was being discussed online anymore. What started as a custody-related legal update had transformed into a multi-layered narrative involving disputed timelines, resurfaced personal history, alleged prior awareness, financial speculation, and emotional reinterpretation of past events. And none of it was stabilizing. Each new piece of information didn't resolve the confusion, it deepened it. And as that complexity increased, so did public frustration. Because audiences weren't just trying to understand the situation anymore, they were trying to reconcile it with everything they previously believed. And that is where emotional tension peaks. The reveal that sets up everything next then came the most unsettling shift yet. A final wave of discussion began focusing on the idea that this entire situation may have been quietly escalating long before any court became involved, that the legal case didn't start the story. It only exposed it, and once that idea took hold, it reframed every earlier moment in a completely new light. Every interview, every public appearance, every statement that once seemed ordinary, now being reinterpreted as part of a much longer chain of events. And that realization led to one unavoidable conclusion spreading across discussions everywhere. If this is what has already come out, there may be far more that still hasn't. And whatever comes next may not just escalate the story further, it may completely redefine it again. By the time the latest wave of claims hit social media, the story had already escaped the boundaries of a normal online discussion. It wasn't just trending anymore. It was dominating timelines, comment sections, reaction channels, and even small corners of mainstream commentary, where people usually avoid anything even remotely close to controversy. And the reason was simple. Too many angles, too many interpretations, and no single verified version strong enough to shut the conversation down. So instead of fading out like most internet drama eventually does, this one expanded. Social media reaches peak overload on platforms like X, TikTok, and YouTube. The reaction wasn't unified. It was fragmented into completely different realities. One group of users treated everything as overblown speculation, insisting that online communities were once again connecting unrelated details into a dramatic narrative that didn't reflect reality. But another group was doing the opposite. They were building timelines, mapping events, comparing past interviews with newly resurfaced clips, and treating every inconsistency as another missing piece of a larger puzzle. The result wasn't discussion, it was division. And that division made the topic spread even faster, because conflict drives visibility, and visibility fuels more investigation. Influencers step into the conversation. As the conversation grew, commentary creators quickly picked up on the trend. Breakdown videos began appearing within hours of each new development. Some focused on legal interpretation, trying to explain what court-ordered reviews typically involve and what they don't imply. Others leaned fully into narrative analysis, treating the situation like an unfolding documentary story. And a smaller group took a more skeptical approach, warning viewers not to trust fragmented leaks or anonymous summaries circulating online. But even those cautionary voices couldn't slow the momentum, because audiences weren't just watching anymore. They were participating. Every viewer had their own theory. Every comment section became a debate arena, and every new upload added another layer of interpretation. Split reactions, support versus suspicion. As expected, public opinion split sharply into two dominant camps. One side defended the individuals involved, emphasizing that family matters are complex, private, and often far messier than what appears online. They argued that the internet was taking incomplete information and turning it into a dramatic storyline that didn't respect real-world consequences. The other side, however, wasn't convinced. They pointed to what they saw as repeated inconsistencies across timelines, resurfaced content, and newly discussed legal developments. To them, the pattern felt too coordinated to dismiss entirely. Not proof of wrongdoing, but enough to question the official narrative being presented. And that tension between protect privacy and demand clarity became the central conflict of the entire online reaction cycle. Industry circles quietly react while public platforms exploded with commentary. Reactions inside industry circles were noticeably quieter, but far more cautious. People connected to media, entertainment commentary, and digital reporting began privately acknowledging that the situation had become unusually complex for a standard celebrity-related controversy, not because of any confirmed revelations, but because of the volume of circulating claims and how quickly they were evolving. Some commentators privately expressed concern about how rapidly unverified fragments were being treated as fact. Others noted that once legal language enters online discourse, audiences tend to assume a level of confirmation that may not actually exist. And that gap between perception and reality is where misinformation grows fastest. The algorithm effect takes over behind the scenes. The platforms themselves played a major role in amplifying the situation. Engagement-based algorithms pushed related content aggressively. Old clips resurfaced alongside new commentary reaction, appeared next to breakdown threads, and speculative posts were recommended even to users who had never searched for the topic. This created a feedback loop. The more people engaged, the more content appeared. The more content appeared, the more people became aware. And the more awareness spread, the more interpretations multiplied. It wasn't just organic interest anymore. It was algorithmic acceleration. Emotional reactions intensify the narrative. What made this situation different from typical viral controversies was the emotional intensity attached to it. People weren't reacting neutrally. They were reacting personally. Some felt sympathy for the individuals involved, emphasizing the pressure of living under constant public scrutiny. Others felt frustration, believing too many unanswered questions were being ignored or brushed aside. And a third group simply felt overwhelmed by how quickly the narrative was changing shape. Because every day brought a new layer. Every layer contradicted or complicated the last, and no one could agree on where the truth actually sat. Commentary channels turned it into a full series. As engagement grew, long-form creators began turning the situation into multi-part breakdown series. Each episode focused on a different angle. Timeline reconstruction, resurfaced interviews, legal speculation explained in general terms, and audience theory breakdowns. These videos accumulated massive attention because they gave structure to something that otherwise felt chaotic. But even structured explanations couldn't fully contain the unpredictability of the narrative, because new claims kept emerging while older ones were still being processed, and every new development reset the conversation again. The rise of hidden timeline theories. One of the most viral concepts to emerge from this phase was the idea of a hidden timeline. Users began suggesting that the publicly known sequence of events might not reflect the full reality of what occurred behind the scenes. They pointed to gaps in documentation, shifts in public appearances, and moments where details were either unclear or never publicly expanded upon. To supporters of this theory, those gaps weren't coincidences. They were signs of missing context. To critics, they were simply normal inconsistencies that occur when private lives intersect with public storytelling. But regardless of interpretation, the theory spread widely enough to become a central talking point. Media outlets remained careful, but watchful traditional media outlets approached the situation with significantly more caution. Most avoided definitive claims, instead focusing on the broader phenomenon. How quickly online narratives can evolve from speculation into widely believed storylines, without official confirmation. Analysts pointed out that modern viral controversies often develop faster than factual reporting cycles can keep up with. By the time verified information is available, public perception is often already locked in. And that makes situations like this extremely difficult to correct once they reach mass attention. A culture split in real time. At its core, the reaction wasn't just about one story anymore. It became a reflection of how audiences consume information in the digital age. Some people trusted official silence until statements were made. Others trusted patterns they believed they could see forming across fragments of information. And both groups accused the other of being naive. This divide turned a single narrative into a cultural split about belief itself. Do you trust institutions and verified reports? Or do you trust patterns and perceived connections? And neither side was willing to fully step back. The pressure continues to build as public and industry reactions intensified. One thing became increasingly clear. The story wasn't stabilizing. It was accelerating. Every new clip, every old post, every alleged leak added pressure to an already unstable narrative structure. And with no definitive resolution from official channels, the vacuum continued to fill itself with speculation. At this stage, the situation had reached a point where even neutral observers admitted one thing. Whether the claims were accurate, exaggerated, or completely misinterpreted, the conversation itself had taken on a life of its own. And that meant the next development wouldn't just be another update, it would be a turning point. Because once public reaction reaches this level of intensity, something always breaks next. Just when it looked like the conversation had reached its loudest point, something happened that nobody in the online space was prepared for. Not another rumor, not another reposted clip, not another insider claim, but a sudden procedural update that shifted the entire direction of the case without warning. It came quietly at first, buried inside legal tracking updates and courthouse scheduling notes. But within hours, it was everywhere. Because according to multiple circulating reports tied to the ongoing proceedings, the case wasn't just continuing, it was being expanded. The case expansion nobody expected. Instead of narrowing down toward resolution, the court reportedly approved additional review scope. That meant new submissions, new verification requests, and potentially new testimony categories being added into the record. And that single procedural shift changed everything, because it signaled one clear thing to observers. The court was not satisfied that the existing record told the full story. And when a judge reaches that point in a case like this, it usually means one thing. There are still unanswered contradictions that need clarification. But what made this development even more explosive wasn't just the expansion itself. It was what insiders began whispering almost immediately afterward. That the next phase of review might include previously unexamined private communications and historical relationship documentation that had not yet been fully evaluated in open proceedings. And that's when the internet froze for a moment, because everyone understood what that implied. This wasn't just about confirming facts anymore. It was about reconstructing intent, the twist that reframes everything. Within hours of the update spreading, a new claim surfaced that completely changed the emotional tone of the entire narrative. Anonymous legal commentary sources began suggesting that parts of the timeline being reviewed may not simply involve uncertainty, but selective disclosure of information at key moments. In other words, the question was no longer just what happened. It was what was known, and when it was known. That distinction is where cases stop being straightforward. Because knowledge changes responsibility, and responsibility changes outcomes. Suddenly, people weren't debating surface-level contradictions anymore. They were asking deeper questions. Who had full awareness at the start? Who learned things later? And who may have been operating under incomplete understanding while major decisions were being made? None of these questions had confirmed answers. But the fact that they were now being discussed in connection with official proceedings was enough to send the narrative into another spiral. The private document that reappeared as the conversation escalated again, another detail resurfaced online, one that had previously been overlooked in earlier waves of discussion. A reference to a private document allegedly submitted during earlier stages of the case, not publicly released, not officially confirmed in detail, but described by discussion threads as a supporting timeline affidavit. What made it significant wasn't just its existence. It was what users claimed it contained, a structured outline of relationship milestones that differed in subtle but important ways from the public narrative. Even minor discrepancies, like timing gaps or sequence shifts, became explosive in the current environment. Because at this stage of the story, nothing was minor anymore. Everything was a signal. Everything was a clue. And everything was being reinterpreted in real time. The emotional collapse of certainty, what made this phase of the story so intense, wasn't just the new information. It was the psychological effect it was having on the audience. People who had followed the situation from the beginning were now openly admitting they could no longer tell what was fact, interpretation, or speculation. Every update contradicted something they had previously accepted. Every explanation created a new set of questions. And every attempt to stabilize the narrative only revealed another layer beneath it. That collapse of certainty created something unusual, a shared sense of confusion across all sides of the debate. Even people who disagreed completely on interpretation agreed on one thing: the situation had moved beyond simple explanation. The final public silence before the storm then came something even more unsettling, a sudden pause. No major new statements, no fresh clarifications. No official counter-reports addressing the latest wave of speculation, just silence. And in high-profile situations like this, silence never feels neutral. It feels intentional. Some interpreted it as legal caution, others saw it as strategic restraint. But online, silence always fills itself with meaning. And in this case, it filled itself with anticipation. Because whenever a story reaches this level of intensity and then suddenly goes quiet, something usually follows. The cliffhanger that changes everything late in the cycle of updates, one final claim began circulating. At first, it appeared as a vague mention in discussion threads. Then it spread into commentary videos. Then it started appearing in breakdown posts. And it suggested something that instantly reignited the entire situation. That additional testimony related to early-stage relationship awareness may soon be introduced into the record. Not confirmed. Not officially released. But enough to trigger immediate speculation about what that could mean for everything previously understood. Because if even partially true, it would mean the story so far is still missing its most important chapter, and that realization created the final unsettling shift in tone. This wasn't a finished narrative, it wasn't even close. It was a developing structure with key pieces still withheld from public view. And as viewers processed that possibility, one question rose above everything else. If this is what has already surfaced publicly, what exactly is still waiting to come out? And more importantly, when it does come out, who will it change the most? The case isn't closing, it's widening. And whatever comes next is going to rewrite the entire conversation again. And just like that, the story is nowhere near finished. What started as scattered online chatter has now turned into a full-scale unfolding narrative, with twists, contradictions, leaked claims, and courtroom developments all colliding at once. Every update seems to raise more questions than it answers, and every final piece turns out to be just another beginning. So now the real question is simple. Where do you stand in all of this? Because at this point, there are no passive viewers left. Everyone following this situation has formed an opinion, even if it keeps changing with every new detail that surfaces. Some of you believe this is all being blown out of proportion. A situation where incomplete information is being stitched together into something far more dramatic than reality. Others feel the opposite, that too many details are lining up in ways that can't be ignored, and that what's coming next might completely reshape everything people thought they understood. And then there's the group sitting in the middle, watching, waiting, trying to separate fact from speculation, while the story keeps evolving faster than anyone can keep up with. But here's what makes this situation different from everything else online right now. It's not slowing down. Every day brings new claims, new interpretations, new angles. And the deeper people dig, the more complex it becomes. So the real conversation isn't just about what has already happened. It's about what happens next. Do you think the court developments will eventually clarify everything and settle the debate once and for all? Or do you believe this is only the surface of a much larger situation that is still waiting to fully unfold? Drop your thoughts below, because this is one of those rare stories where every perspective adds another piece to the bigger picture. And if you've been following this from the beginning, you already know one thing for sure. Nothing about this case feels final yet. New details are still emerging. New interpretations are still forming. And every update has the potential to shift the entire narrative again. So make sure you stay tuned, stay aware, and stay ready for whatever comes next. Because the next update might not just add to the story, it might completely change it. And when it does, you'll want to be here to see it first.